Something goes very still in a person after they've been broken one too many times. You can feel it when you walk into the room, even if nothing visible has changed. They're sitting where they always sit. They're answering when spoken to. But something that used to fill the space around them has retracted, and everyone present can sense its absence without being able to name what they're missing. Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact stillness, and what he found should make anyone reconsider how they've been treating the sensitive people in their life. Because the empath who breaks doesn't break the way other people break. They don't get loud, they don't escalate. They go quiet in a way that's almost geological, a slow shifting of plates deep underneath the surface, after which nothing in the relationship ever stands in the same place again. The people who pushed them there, the partners, the parents, the friends, the colleagues, who treated their sensitivity as something to be exploited or worn down, almost always expect the empath to come back. Empaths always come back. That's been the pattern of the empath's entire life. They absorb the hit, process it in solitude, and eventually return to the relationship with their hands open. It's exactly what makes them so easy to mistreat in the first place. The mistreatment never seems to leave any permanent mark, until one day it does. And by the time anyone realizes that, it's already far too late to undo. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung actually understood about this moment, what happens psychologically when an empath crosses the line from breakable to broken open, why the change cannot be reversed by apology or explanation, what the people who cause the break are about to lose without knowing they're losing it, and why the empath themselves often doesn't recognize, until much later, that something inside them has rearranged permanently. This isn't a story about revenge. It's something stranger and quieter. It's about the way a particular kind of person, after enough years of being treated as inexhaustible, finally discovers an exhaustion so complete that it changes their architecture. To start, you need to understand what an empath actually is, because the popular definition has become so diluted that the word barely carries weight anymore. Jung wasn't romantic about empaths. He observed them in his practice with the precision he brought to everything else. And what he recognized was that most people who function as empaths in adulthood developed that capacity for a reason. They were children in environments that required them to track another person's emotional weather constantly. A parent whose moods could turn dangerous without warning. A family system that survived only because someone was monitoring it, absorbing tension, smoothing over the cracks before anyone else noticed them. These children grew up reading rooms the way other people read books. They learned to identify the shift in someone's posture 3 seconds before that person knew they were upset. They learned to anticipate needs that hadn't been spoken yet. They learned that their own feelings came second or third or last because the family's stability depended on their capacity to absorb without complaint. And the world rewarded them for it. Their friends found them comforting. Their partners found them generous. Their bosses found them dependable. Wherever they went, they became the person others leaned on, the one who held space, who didn't flinch from difficult emotions, who always seemed to have more to give. The empath's entire identity got built around a single, unspoken contract. You stay regulated for everyone else, and in exchange, you get to belong. Jung saw something disturbing in this dynamic. He recognized that the empath's giving wasn't always coming from a place of abundance. Often it was coming from a place of fear. Underneath the generosity was an old child's belief that if they stopped attending to everyone else, they'd be cast out, abandoned, left alone with their own unprocessed reality. The empathy was real, the compassion was real, but it was being powered by an engine that had been built in childhood out of necessity, not choice. And engines built that way can run a very long time before they burn out. But they do burn out. Always. This is the context in which the break happens. The empath isn't a fragile creature waiting to be wounded by the smallest slight. They've been absorbing impact their entire life. They've forgiven things most people wouldn't even tolerate once. They've explained themselves 1,000 times to people who refuse to listen. They've made themselves smaller, quieter, more accommodating, more available. Over and over, year after year, in the silent hope that this time it would be enough. That this time, the person they loved would meet them halfway. The break, when it finally comes, isn't triggered by the worst thing that ever happened to them. That's what almost everyone gets wrong. The empath has already survived the worst thing. They survived it years ago and twice more after that, and they kept coming back. The break is triggered by something that, from the outside, looks almost minor. A small dismissal, a familiar betrayal, a repetition of something they've already forgiven a dozen times before. But this time, something happens internally that didn't happen the other times. Jung described it as a moment when the unconscious finally overrides the conscious will. For years, the empath's conscious mind has been saying, stay, forgive, understand, give them another chance. And for years, the deeper psyche has been recording everything. Every dismissal, every broken promise, every moment of being asked to make their own pain smaller so someone else didn't have to feel uncomfortable. The unconscious has been keeping a ledger the conscious mind didn't know existed. When that ledger reaches a certain threshold, the deeper psyche makes a decision the conscious mind can't override. Something shuts, not loudly, not with declarations. The way a door shuts in another room of a house you're not standing in. You don't hear it close. You only notice later that something that used to be open isn't open anymore. The empath in this moment often doesn't realize what's happened. They go to bed feeling tired, the way they've felt tired 1,000 other nights. They wake up the next day and something is different, but they can't articulate what. They look at the person who hurt them, and they don't feel anger. They don't feel hurt. They don't feel the familiar pull to repair the rupture. They just feel nothing. A profound, almost spacious nothing, where for years there had been an entire weather system of feeling. This is the part everyone misunderstands. This nothing isn't depression. It isn't dissociation. It isn't the empath shutting down because they can't handle their emotions. Jung would have recognized it as the opposite. The empath finally seeing clearly, without the distortion of attachment, what's actually in front of them. The fog that empathy creates when it's pointed at someone unworthy of it has lifted. And what's revealed underneath that fog is so different from what the empath has been believing for years that the recognition lands as silence rather than rage. The person who broke them often picks up on this shift within hours. They can't name what's different, but they feel it. The empath responds when spoken to, but there's no reach in the response. There's no emotional current running underneath the words. The familiar dynamic, where the empath would get hurt, then explain why they were hurt, then accept whatever apology was offered and rebuild the connection, has stopped working because the first step of the cycle isn't happening. The empath isn't getting hurt. They're just observing. This is where the regret begins, though the person who caused the break usually doesn't recognize it as regret yet. They feel uneasy, off balance. They try the old moves, the small affection, the qualified apology, the redirection toward shared memory, and none of them produce the response they used to. The empath receives these moves the way someone might receive a transmission from very far away. They register the signal. They just don't have anything in them that responds to it. What's actually happened, in Jungian terms, is that the empath has withdrawn what he called libido from the relationship, not in the sexual sense, but in the older meaning of the word, psychic energy, life force, the investment of self into another. For years, the empath has been pouring this energy into the connection, often without realizing it, often when nothing was being poured back. That energy is what made the empath feel things on behalf of the other person. It's what made them invest in the relationship's potential rather than its reality. It's what kept them seeing the best version of someone who consistently delivered the worst. When the unconscious finally closes the ledger, that energy gets pulled back into the empath, all of it. Years and years of misdirected investment returning home at once, and from the outside, the empath looks emptier. From the inside, they're more full than they've been in decades. They just don't have anything to give to the relationship that broke them, because they're finally giving it to themselves. If you've been feeling something settle into stillness inside you lately, a quiet where there used to be a current, a calm that everyone around you seems disturbed by, we've put together something built for exactly this kind of threshold. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's work, designed for the period when the old emotional reflexes have stopped firing and you're trying to understand what's taking their place. The link is right below this video. But stay with me, because what comes next is the part of this process that most people are never prepared for. The transformation that begins in the days after the break is the part that the person who caused the rupture never sees coming. They expect the silence to be temporary. They've seen the empath go quiet before, usually for a few days, sometimes a week, while the empath processed whatever wound had been inflicted. They expect a return. They're already preparing for the conversation in which the empath comes back with their feelings articulated, and the relationship can resume its old pattern of rupture and repair. What they don't understand is that this silence isn't preparation for that conversation. The empath isn't gathering their feelings to present them. The empath isn't going through their usual processing arc. Something more fundamental is happening. The internal scaffolding that made them an empath in the relationship, the constant emotional attention they paid to the other person, the unconscious decision to monitor the connection for them both, has come down, and it's not going back up. Jung observed this in his patients again and again. He saw people who had spent decades in psychological service to someone else, to a parent, a spouse, a sibling, a community, reach a point where the service became impossible to continue. He noticed that when this happened, the change wasn't a phase. The people who underwent it didn't return to being the person who had given so freely before. They couldn't. The capacity for that specific kind of giving, to that specific person or pattern, had been spent. And what emerged in its place was something the empath themselves often found unfamiliar at first. A self that had its own gravity, its own perspective, its own ability to stand inside a room without immediately reaching out to manage everyone in it. For the person who caused the break, this transformation reveals itself slowly and devastatingly. The first thing they notice is that their old methods of repair don't work. The gestures that used to bring the empath back into emotional connection now land on empty ground. The empath thanks them politely and doesn't engage. There's no fight to have, because the empath isn't fighting. There's no wound to address, because the empath isn't presenting one. There's just this strange, even-toned distance where there used to be a person who would have moved mountains for them. The second thing they notice is that the empath has stopped explaining. For years, perhaps decades, the empath has been articulating their needs, their hurts, their hopes for the relationship, usually patiently, often repeatedly, always with the assumption that if they could just find the right words, the other person would finally understand. After the break, that effort vanishes. The empath stops trying to be understood. They've concluded, in some place beneath conscious decision, that the project of being understood by this particular person isn't a project worth their remaining life. And the moment that conclusion lands, the explaining ends, permanently. The third thing they notice, and this is often when the regret begins to take its full shape, is that the empath has started building a life that doesn't include them. Not dramatically, not vindictively, just slowly, in small daily choices that add up. The empath starts saying no to invitations that would have included the breaker. They start protecting their time without apology. They start using the energy that used to flow into the relationship for other purposes, for creative work that had been dormant for years, for friendships that had been neglected, for a deeper relationship with their own interior life that had been crowded out by constant attention to someone else's emotional weather. The breaker realizes, often around this point, that they had been benefiting from something they never properly acknowledged. The empath had been holding the relationship together with a kind of psychological labor so consistent it became invisible. The breaker had grown accustomed to being met emotionally without having to do the work of meeting in return. They had been the recipient of an attentiveness so reliable that they'd stopped registering it as a gift. Now that the attentiveness is gone, they feel its absence as a kind of cold. The world is quieter than it used to be. Conversations are less warm. Their own emotional landscape, which they had outsourced without realizing it to the empath's monitoring, is suddenly their own responsibility, and they don't know how to carry it. And the empath, meanwhile, is undergoing a transformation that Jung described as one of the most significant psychological events a person can experience. The release of pent-up libido, that psychic energy that had been bound up in a relationship that gave nothing back, produces a kind of inner expansion. The empath starts noticing things about themselves they hadn't had room to notice before, preferences they didn't know they had, talents they'd been ignoring, forms of pleasure that didn't require anyone else's validation. They also start seeing the past with new eyes. This is the part that's hardest for the empath, and it's where most of the actual grief of the break lives. Because as the fog of overextended empathy lifts, the empath sees patterns that had been invisible while they were inside them. They see how long the imbalance had been going on. They see moments when they'd been treated badly and explained it away to themselves. They see years of evidence that the relationship had been costing them more than it was giving, and they see, with painful clarity, how skilled they'd become at not seeing it. This recognition isn't pleasant, but it's clarifying. And the clarity changes something in the empath that can't be unchanged. Once you've seen a pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you've recognized that you've been giving in a direction where giving doesn't grow anything, you can't return to that direction without violating something essential about yourself. The break creates a kind of psychological one-way door. The empath walks through it, and on the other side, the room they used to live in becomes inaccessible. They can remember it. They can describe it. They can even feel a faint sadness about it, but they cannot go back into it. This is why the person who broke them experiences such profound regret, often years later, when they finally understand what happened. They had assumed they were dealing with a relationship that operated like other relationships, where damage could be repaired, where wounds could heal, where time could restore what had been lost. They didn't understand that the empath's particular psychology operates differently. The empath's loyalty is enormous, but it runs on something more like a budget than an inexhaustible supply. And once the budget has been spent, once enough years of dismissal and minimization and being treated as endlessly available have run the account down to zero, there's no deposit that can be made to restore it. The account doesn't reopen. The institution holding it has closed. What makes this so painful for the person who caused the break is that they often don't realize what they had until they no longer have it. The empath's attention had been a kind of climate they lived in. They didn't notice the temperature of it while it was around them. They only notice now, in its absence, that they're cold in ways they didn't know they could be. The empath had been holding 1,000 small things in the relationship, remembering anniversaries, anticipating moods, providing a kind of emotional ground that made the breaker's life feel more stable than it actually was. With all of that gone, the breaker's life feels suddenly precarious in ways they can't explain. They sometimes try to find this quality in someone else. They look for another empath, another person with that same generous attention, another relationship that will give them what they had before without requiring anything new of them. And sometimes they succeed, temporarily. They find someone who hasn't yet been broken, who still has the budget intact, who still believes that giving will be met with giving back. But the breaker, having had the experience once, often repeats the pattern. They don't realize what they're doing. They just notice that this new connection eventually goes quiet too, in the same way the old one did, and they can't understand why they keep ending up in rooms where the warmth has gone out. The empath, meanwhile, has often moved into a different kind of life entirely. Jung observed that people who completed this kind of break tended to enter what he called the second phase of psychological development, a period in which the energy that had been spent on managing relationships gets redirected into the development of self. They become more themselves than they've ever been. The qualities that had been suppressed in service of being palatable to the relationship, directness, discernment, the willingness to disappoint others when disappointment is appropriate, start coming forward. The empath becomes harder to manipulate. They become harder to flatter. They become harder to guilt into providing what they don't want to provide. This doesn't make them cold. The capacity for empathy doesn't disappear. It just becomes selective in ways it wasn't before. The empath still feels other people deeply. They still recognize pain. They still respond to genuine need. But they've developed something that Jung considered essential to psychological maturity: the ability to distinguish between someone who is suffering and someone who is using the appearance of suffering to extract resources. The fog of indiscriminate empathy is gone, and underneath it, a more precise instrument has emerged. The empath can now tell, often within minutes, whether a person in front of them is genuinely wounded or performing wound to access their care. And once they can tell, they stop being available to the second category. The room they walk into now is a quieter room than it used to be. Some people who had been close to them drift away because they can't access what they used to access. Some relationships that had been built on the empath's old overgiving simply can't survive the empath's new clarity. The empath loses people. They sometimes grieve those losses, but they don't reverse the change to bring those people back because they understand, in a way they didn't before, that what those relationships required of them was something they're no longer willing to provide. What emerges in place of the lost relationships is harder to describe. Jung talked about a quality of presence that developed in people after this kind of transformation. A kind of weight, a centeredness, a way of moving through the world that other people picked up on without being able to name. These people became, in some sense, more visible. They took up the space they were actually in, rather than shrinking themselves to make others comfortable. They could be in a room without scanning it for what everyone else needed. They could listen to someone's problem without immediately taking it on as their own to solve. They had become, in Jung's framework, individuated, separated finally from the constant entanglement with others' emotional lives that had defined them for so long. And the strange thing about this state, the thing that's hardest to convey to someone who hasn't reached it, is that it isn't lonely the way the empath might have feared loneliness would be. The empath had spent their life surrounded by people whose presence they constantly monitored, and that surround had often felt strangely empty, full of bodies but short on actual contact. The new state, with fewer people in it, often feels more populated, because the people who are still there are people the empath has actually chosen, people who give back, people whose presence doesn't require the empath to manage them, people who don't drain the empath's psychic resources just by being in proximity. The room got smaller, but the room got real. The person who broke them, watching all of this from outside, often experiences it as a kind of mystery. They knew the empath. They lived with the empath. They thought they understood the empath. And now there's this person who looks similar but operates by completely different rules, who doesn't respond to the old levers, who seems to be doing fine without them in a way that feels almost insulting. They don't recognize what's happened because the change happened underneath the surface, in territory they never paid attention to. They had always related to the empath's surface, to the giving, to the warmth, to the availability, and the surface had been propped up by an entire interior architecture they'd never even noticed. When that architecture collapsed and rebuilt itself, the surface looked similar enough that the change wasn't visible, but everything underneath was different, and the new structure didn't have a door that led to them. This is what Jung meant when he warned against treating sensitive people carelessly. He understood that sensitivity wasn't weakness. It was a particular psychological orientation that, when treated with respect, could sustain extraordinary connection, and when treated with contempt, could rearrange itself into a configuration that no longer included the person who had been contemptuous. The threat wasn't dramatic. The empath wasn't going to retaliate. The empath wasn't going to seek revenge. The empath was simply going to stop being available, and the stopping would be permanent. And by the time anyone realized it had happened, the foundation that might have been preserved would already be gone. The regret that follows is a quiet regret. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small moments, the realization, 3 years after the break, that no one has called to check on you in months. The recognition, in a quiet apartment, that the warmth you'd taken for granted had a specific source, and that source has moved on. The slow, dawning understanding that the empath, who you had assumed would always be there, had been the load-bearing wall of an entire emotional structure, and removing them didn't bring the structure down dramatically. It just made the structure colder and quieter and harder to live inside. Sometimes the person who caused the break tries to reach out. Years later, after they've finally understood what they lost, they send a message, they make a phone call, they show up, they bring the apology they should have brought a decade earlier. And the empath, on the other side, receives this with a kind of distant tenderness. They aren't cruel, they aren't dismissive. They've just become someone for whom this person no longer occupies a central place. They can acknowledge the apology. They can even feel a small warmth toward the person offering it. But they cannot reopen the door because the door is no longer there. The wall has grown over where the door used to be, and the empath's new life is built around the wall rather than the opening. This is the regret you'll feel if you break an empath. Not the dramatic regret of losing someone in a fight. The slow, structural regret of realizing too late that you had been living inside the gift of their attention without ever recognizing it as a gift. That you had assumed it was the natural temperature of the room rather than something they were generating at cost for years on your behalf. That you had treated their patience as endless and discovered too late that endlessness wasn't what it was. It was just a longer rope than most people offer, and you reached the end of it without noticing you were getting close. There's a particular silence that settles into the life of someone who has broken an empath and only later realized what they lost. It isn't loud, it isn't punishing, it's just there, in the background. A soft and continuous reminder of a warmth that used to be in the room and isn't anymore. And no replacement quite fills it, because the empath wasn't replaceable. They were a specific person whose specific attention had been bent toward you for reasons you never fully understood, and now that attention is bent elsewhere, toward themselves, toward a life that was waiting underneath the life they'd been living. And you can see it sometimes from a distance, but you can't enter it. You're outside that life now, and you'll be outside it for the rest of yours. If any of this is landing as something you've been living through, from either side of the break, the True Self-Discovery Guide was built for exactly this terrain. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, designed for the period when something inside you has shifted, and you're trying to make sense of what's settling into the space where the old patterns used to live. The link is right below.